It's time again for another installment of The Basics, and on today's show I want to talk about the demise of Scrye Magazine. Scrye Magazine was your source for collectible card games for many years before it started going downhill and ultimately fell apart and vanished. And I'll explain why this happened. So let's get started, shall we? Now, to those of you who may or may not know this, Scrye Magazine started back in 1994 as primarily a price guide for Magic the Gathering. In a couple short years or less, it started encompassing a lot of the other CCGs that were starting to come out, most notably Star Trek CCG, Star Wars CCG, X-Files CCG, Overpower. You'd have a lot of really well-written articles from knowledgeable authors that were also heavy into playing these CCGs. There were price guides for almost every CCG at the time. They're comprehensive. You had opinion pieces. You had deck guides. There was a small section where you could find out what the latest expansion was for the CCG you played and when it was coming out. There were company profiles from the CCG manufacturers. You saw a lot of coverage from tournaments and the decks used by the champions of said tournaments, from regionals to worlds. Scrye really was the best resource out there for any CCG player. And you have to remember, this is just before the start of the internet and when the internet was in its infancy. There was a lot more information packed into this monthly magazine than anything else. Yes, you had to wait month by month to get it, but for me, as a kid in the 90s that was addicted to CCGs, Scrye was my go-to. I could not wait for the next Scrye to come out so I could learn what it contained about the CCGs I was playing, or maybe CCGs that I wanted to play. Mind you, I didn't always have enough money to buy a Scrye magazine at the time, but, you know, it was something worth waiting for when you did have the money. Scrye lasted until 2009 when it finally went under, and one of the differences between Scrye in the 1990s and Scrye in the 2000s is that in the 1990s, Scrye was complete. You had coverage for almost every major CCG and some minor ones. You had enough to keep you busy on those CCGs, plus the price guides. They had a lot of feature articles based on the different CCGs. So whereas with Inquest magazine, which was heavily biased towards Magic, most of their articles and features were toward Magic, which is fine. But most of us that were into multiple CCGs wanted something that was wide encompassing for all of them, and that was Scrye Magazine. They had such issues with features came out, like one for the X-Files CCG upon its release. This is a magazine you've seen earlier on my show. It contains the complete rule set, supplement, and card list for the CCG. You've got the First Contact feature for when the First Contact expansion came out for the Star Trek CCG. Amazing. You had this awesome editorial for the Star Wars CCG, and this was the same Scrye issue that came with the Warp Pack, as well as a couple promo cards for Middle-earth and another card game. It really had something for everyone, but the 2000s brought about a bit of a different change for Scrye and led to its downfall. And there were a few factors that led to this. The first being, the magazine started to get a little thinner in the 2000s. It was less about articles and price guides and more about advertisements. As you left the 90s and went into the 2000s, there were more advertisements. Then, and everyone thought that there would be no problem with Scrye, because with the Pokemon craze and later the Yu-Gi-Oh craze, that they would keep going. Unfortunately, Scrye started turning into a different magazine. As you can see with this 2008 issue, they went from being guide to collectible card games to the guide to collectible games. So they started covering everything into Dungeons and Dragons, miniatures, dice, everything. And a lot of the CCG articles were getting smaller and getting squeezed out. And this is when I stopped reading Scrye. Was around 2004, 2005. I stopped buying it. This 2008 one I picked up the year before they went under, because I thought, oh, maybe they've changed it, they've gone back. Nope, it was even worse. One of the nasty surprises was getting a few pages into the magazine after a while. Cheap newsprint, no more glossy paper, the image quality sucked, and the blurbs were just, it was hard to follow after that. And I'm an avid reader. Scrye used to be so good, but it fell so far and it never recovered, and that's a shame because anyone that plays CCGs, any kid that got into them in the 90s, Scrye was the shit. Period. As a bit of an addendum and an epitaph, it is widely said and quoted in certain TV shows and movies that all good things must come to an end at some point. And that was the case with Scrye. They went from a CCG-centric magazine with everything to trying to compete with everything on the planet, including the internet, and expanding to cover everything. They even started doing the odd article about video games. And hardcore CCG players and collectors, namely us, which were buying the magazine, got frustrated and said goodbye. It is what it is. These things do happen. Unfortunately, it happened to Scrye, and it's sad because Scrye holds a special place in my heart. Have a great day, everybody.